not a Bible study per se. I'm going to read to you from Concordia Theological Quarterly from Fort Wayne Seminary. This is an article from 2012, so 10 years ago. And it's called The Reformation and the Invention of History. The author is Corey D. Maas, M-A-A-S. And this is going to start us on a journey to help, I think, us understand the impasse that I am at, and maybe you are too, with Lutheran churches of the Reformation, which requires that I do my public ministry, preach and teach only out of the King James Version, which I have not consented to. And I owe it to you to tell you why, and to leave it, of course, to your conscience. I'd rather be doing a Bible study, I'd rather take you to Disneyland than to the battlefields of the Civil War, so to speak. This is not pleasant to be in the midst of apologetics and back and forth. And it's probably not going to be that with the Lutheran churches of the Reformation, but I am at odds with them on this. And it's a, if not a high school course, it's first year college that we're going to be doing, because we'll take you into the Bible variants, variations in the text. But we've done this before when we studied the doctrine of the church and the ministry. Remember, I would bring a bunch of articles. We would slug our way through them, all finally to end up comfortable with our difference, I guess, with some. And we did it again with the doctrine of the Lord's Supper and consumptionism. We have to eat it all by command of God. It's not pleasant stuff, and I'd rather not bother a person's conscience with it and make you, bring any doubt into you, whether it's in communion or regarding the Bible. But we have to do it. So this is eventually going to be, I think, help us in talking about the scriptures, the texts on which our scriptures are built, and why I'm reluctant to endorse any one Bible version. The Reformation and the Invention of History. The title will undoubtedly strike the reader, if not grossly erroneous, at least exaggerated. One can hardly be unaware that the writing of history long predates that early modern religious upheaval commonly referred to as the Reformation. Many also will be aware of particularly famous names associated with historical writing more than 1,000 years prior to the Reformation. Names such as Eusebius, Tacitus, Levi, or Herodotus. Some will know that Herodotus, who was writing 2,000 years before the world had heard of Martin Luther, would already in the 1st century before Christ be dubbed the father of history. In other words, what is known about the literature of the 2 millennia preceding the Reformation would appear to make it very difficult to speak of any invention of history in the 16th century, the 1500s. What is more, even what is known, or at least what is often believed, about the Reformation itself would seem to compound this difficulty. The British historian Alec Ryrie, for instance, illustrates the sort of thing most people know about the Reformation when he suggests that, quote, Protestantism was in the truest sense a fundamentalist movement. It only accepted a single authority, Holy Scripture, and that authority was absolute. It had no logical need to appeal to custom or history. Making this point even more strongly, another British scholar, Thomas Betteridge, has argued not only that Protestants had no logical need of history, but that any appeal to history on their part would in fact be illogical, noting the Protestant rejection of Catholic doctrines which could only be supported by appeal to what the Roman Church called unwritten verities, unwritten truths. truths that could not be substantiated with the written words of Scripture, Betteridge writes, "In a world based entirely on Scripture, what place is there for history? Indeed, if history and all other non-scriptural writing lacks all authority or truthfulness as an unwritten verity, what is the point of writing?" In other words, there's Scripture's on a par with the unwritten tradition of the Roman. If history is on a par, what is written history is on a par with the unsubstantiated verdicts of the Pope and councils. Why write? That is to say, an unswavering commitment to the doctrine of sola scriptura will logically limit Protestants to biblical scholarship, and therefore prevent them from pursuing anything that might properly be called historical scholarship, especially in the realm of theology. That sounds sort of logical, but we'll find out it's not. The noted German historian Gerald Strauss, however, reminds us that historical reassessments have always coincided with turning points in history. The religious controversy of the 16th century, whatever else it was unquestionably a turning point in history. Even before a thorough analysis of the evidence then, Strauss could confidently claim that it would be astonishing if the Lutheran Reformation had not brought about a searching review of German history. Likewise, and even more to the point, the Doyen, D-O-Y-E-N, I had to look that up. It means spokesperson, senior member. Even more to the point, the Doyen of English Reformation Studies, A.G. Dickens, would conclude that, quote, "The progress of Reformation thought is coupled with a steady enrichment of historical perception and method." Assuming just for the moment that these claims are indeed true, the first question must be, why? If Protestants were in fact moved to define appeals to extra-biblical records of the past as logically unnecessary and perhaps even inadmissible, what then accounts for their consistent and allegedly successful use of history? In attempting to answer this question, it is perhaps worth recalling, first of all, the intellectual context in which the Reformation movement arose, particularly that of Renaissance humanism. As is well known, the humanists in the century before Luther, 1400s, humanists, as well as those contemporaneous with Luther, were driven by the familiar motto, ad fontes, back to the sources. These sources were, of course, the writings of classical antiquity, including the Greek and Roman histories of men, such as the previously mentioned Levi and Tacitus. Also included and most admired on account of his elegant Latin was the preeminent Roman orator Cicero, who advised his own contemporaries that, quote, "To be ignorant of what happened before you is to remain forever a child." This was a conviction eagerly adopted by the humanists. In other words, you need to know what happened before you. It was not simply that classical texts and ideas were being rediscovered during the Renaissance, however. The very fact of their rediscovery at the same time also forced their readers to come to terms with them as historical documents. That is, documents of a particular time and place, very different from that of the 15th and 16th centuries. Unlike medieval annals and chronicles, which began with creation and continued into the present, as if history were simply a long, unbroken chain of events, as for example, the Roman Empire of the 1st century, as if it were the same thing as the Roman Empire of the 13th century. The humanist attempt to understand the world of classical antiquity brought with it, quote, a sense of perspective on the past, a sense crucial in the eventual development of what might be called critical or analytical history. To put it in plain terms, how can you understand the problems of America today without understanding the 20th century? This sense of perspective fostered by the Renaissance humanists and its contribution to critical historyography, how do you say it? Historiography. So the perspective, contribution to historiography is perhaps most famously and most frequently noted in the work of the 15th century Italian Lorenzo Valla, V-A-L-L-A, who demonstrated on historical and grammatical grounds that the so-called donation of Constantine, attributed to the 4th century Emperor Constantine, which ostensibly granted immense authority, both spiritual and temporal, to the papacy, that this document was in fact a much later forgery. So some would trace the papal power back to Constantine, the Holy Roman Empire, who helped instill some earthly authority, temporal authority, into the papal office. The donation of Constantine, this document was called. But it was a forgery. The reason for Valla's frequent mention in this regard will be rather obvious. Not only is his work illustrative of the critical and analytical historiography being developed by Renaissance humanists and subsequently taken up by modern historians, it also highlights why such a method might be immediately and especially attractive to the Protestant reformers of the century following Valla. Thus, it has been argued that building on these humanist foundations, quote, the 16th and early 17th centuries were characterized by an interest in history first and foremost, and that the very omnipresence of history made it the obvious means whereby theologians of all religious parties could affirm their confessional identity, unquote. So all went back to history, both sides of the argument. Roman Catholics and Lutherans. There is undoubtedly much truth to this, but it still must be asked whether and why history was the, quote, obvious means of affirming the confessional identity of Protestants, of those who swore allegiance to Scripture alone. This question especially deserves addressing because to whatever extent history was becoming popular in the 16th century, there remained much about the new humanist historiography that the reformers in fact found unappealing. Humanist histories, like humanist Latin, were consciously modeled on those of classical antiquity. And Luther, to name only one reformer, was not nearly as enamored of the ancients as were many of his humanist contemporaries. However credulous or unpolished the post-classical medieval authors might have been, at least they were not rank pagans, as were the authors of pre-Christian antiquity. Humanist history, then, was not meant simply to inform, but especially to inspire, and particularly to inspire men to act justly, because as Aristotle had insisted, those who act justly become just. That's the gist of a lot of the Greek, the Roman scholarship and history writers and philosophers. But Aristotle, in insisting those who act justly become just, of course, this is precisely the notion of justification that Luther and his fellow reformers railed against. Now, less obviously, as we're talking about why the reformers really delved into history, rediscovered the fact that We have a history. Thus, obviously, but also mitigating against any eager adoption of humanist historiography by the reformers, was a simple lack of patriotic motivation for doing so. The Italian Renaissance and its love of the classics were partially spurred by the belief that the glory of ancient Rome was the Italian heritage. Men like Cicero and Tacitus were their forebears. The Germans, however, had no ancient glory to recall, with the unique exception of the virtue ascribed to them and contrasted with Roman decadence by the historian Tacitus himself. In other words, Germans didn't have any racial, tribal, national acts in the fight of why we like to go back and look at the classics and the history. Far more significant than any differences between Southern Europe, humanists, the Italians, and Northern European reformers, however, is the simple fact that over against a Protestant adherence to Scripture alone, the Roman Church specifically and explicitly claimed history as its own sphere of authority. Illustrating this point is King Henry VIII of England, to whom the papacy granted the title Defender of the Faith because of his persuasive writing against Luther and his doctrine. King Henry VIII. In his 1521 attack on Luther, Henry had dismissed Scripture alone, sola scriptura, and championed the authority of history or tradition by asserting that, quote, many things were said and done by Christ which are not recorded by any of the evangelists, but by the fresh memory of those who were present, delivered afterwards, as it were, from hand to hand, from the very times of the apostles down to us. That is, the historical teachings and traditions of the church, even if unwritten verities, that is, unwritten truths not found in Scripture, that these must be granted equal authority with Scripture because they are assumed to have descended from Christ himself. This is precisely the position officially affirmed later in the 1500s by the Council of Trent. The Council of Trent was commissioned to put Catholic doctrine in writing over against the Lutheran confessions. And they held, just like it was held before by King Henry VIII, that tradition is every bit as worthwhile and authoritative. In other words, the history books were just as full of truth, even in theological matters, as Scripture. Or at least they were ways by which Catholic doctrine could also be proved. In King Henry's own work, though, he was even more explicit about the authoritative nature of the historical record. If any error had been introduced since the time of the apostles, he wrote, then surely someone should be able to point out the time that this occurred by histories. Nor was Henry alone in presenting the reformers with this historical challenge. Still in the 16th century, the Jesuit theologian Edmund Campion would raise the rhetorical question, in what age, upon what occasion, by whose power, hath a new and strange religion invaded, not only that city of Rome, but the whole world besides? Referring to the Lutheran Reformation. In what age, upon what occasion, by whose power, has a new and strange religion invaded? And then into the next century, Catholic apologists, polemicists, would continue to ask, in what Pope's day was the true religion overthrown in Rome? If this had indeed happened, as the Reformers said it had, then certainly Protestants should be able to pinpoint when exactly in the Church's history this perversion had occurred. So strong was the conviction that history corroborated the claims of the Roman Church that the late Richard Marius could claim that for a staunch defender of the papacy, such as Thomas More, quote, and it's not from More, but from Marius, the meaning of history was so intertwined with the Catholic Church that if the Church were false, history made no sense at all. Started putting the cart before the horse. Just a little note here on Thomas More. You probably heard the name. Catholic theologian. More was born in 1478, so contemporaneous with Martin Luther. Statesman, humanist, born in London, educated in Oxford and London. Lived 4 years under discipline of the Carthusian monks. And often Luther just gets down on the Carthusian monks. And has not much use for them. He opposed Martin Luther in 1523 in controversy with William Tyndale in 1528, a Lord Chancellor of England in 1529 to 1532, beheaded on charge of high treason, I suppose, when the Protestants gained some influence in England. Works include Utopia. Have you ever seen Ever After? The heroiness. That's her favorite book because it was given to her by her dad, Utopia. I've never read it. Have you? Is it long?
It's more. Did they write
More
anything
for
short? Oh man.
In the movie, it's portrayed as like.
Yeah.
It's like reading this. It's not exactly a page turner.
Right. A little dry.
Convoluted a little.
So if demonstrating the truthfulness of the Roman religion, history, it was assumed, also thereby demonstrated prima facie, or self-evidently, history also demonstrated felicity of Protestant claims. The result of this assumption was that the wide variety of Rome's rhetorical questions and challenges and taunts became distilled into one very pointed historical question hurled at the reformers: where was your church before Luther? Luther invented it. It was this question that eventually the reformers would have to answer. In one respect, then, it might be said that the very nature of the controversies of the Reformation forced historical questions to the fore. Contrary to the previously noted suggestion that appeals to history were not logically necessary for Protestants, Rosemary O'Day has insisted that historiography was, therefore, a science which the religious must master, and not a luxury. Even before such explicit challenges were presented, the utility of history in the Reformation debates had become apparent quite by accident. Before Campion, before More or Henry VIII threw down the historical gauntlet, and while still testing the validity of his 95 Theses against indulgences, Luther, in preparation for debate on the subject, began a historical investigation of church councils, papal decrees, and canon law. So quite early in Luther's career, he recognized that he had to face this question about historicity. Though primarily looking for data immediately relevant to the indulgence controversy, Luther discovered far more than he had anticipated. Throughout its long history, the Church had, in fact, regularly reversed and even condemned some of its own positions, making any claims to a historic consensus and continuity of teaching dubious at best. It was this first foray into history that awakened Luther to the possible benefits of a sustained, systematic study of history. So much so that already in 1520, Luther could make the novel proposal that universities endow chairs for the teaching of history. It was Luther's growing fondness for history that would prompt those statements, still regularly heralded by history professors everywhere, that history is, quote, the mother of truth, that histories, quote, are a very precious thing, and that, quote, historians, therefore, are the most useful people and the best teachers, so that one can never honor, praise, and thank them enough, unquote. And I'm sort of lean that way myself. Luther did more, though, than simply praise historians and encourage the establishment of history as a discipline in the university. He himself would take up research and writing in the field. He would publish his own refutation of the spurious donation of Constantine, for example, and would write numerous prefaces and forewords to the histories penned by his contemporaries. That which has been described as, quote, the most sophisticated historical analysis to come from Luther's pen, unquote, was, though, his 1539 treatise on the councils and the church. In this work, Luther turned his full attention to the history of the church, the writings of its theologians, and the pronouncements of its official councils. Here he greatly expanded on the theses that he had first put forward 20 years previously in preparation for the Leipzig debate in 1517. On issues not clearly revealed in Scripture, the Church had never reached unanimity. Quite the contrary. The pre-Reformation Church had, with an astonishing regularity, contradicted itself, reversed its decisions, instituted new doctrines and rituals, or abolished old teachings and rites. As only one of the most important examples, Luther there demonstrated in his 1539 on the councils in the church, Luther there demonstrated that the office of the Pope as supreme head of the church and even supreme temporal authority was an office altogether unknown, not only in Scripture, but also in the early church. Such arguments have allowed at least one modern scholar to suggest that Luther, quote, rested his case for separation from Rome mainly on a historical argument, namely the gradual evolution of the hierarchical system of the church contrary to the design of Christ. That he rested his case for separation mainly on a historical argument is not true, although this guy said that to be true. History was certainly involved. The papacy had wrested authority from the pastoral office and from congregations, and that can be historically proved. And in misuse of that stolen authority, began to promulgate a doctrine contrary to justification. And so it's really theological grounds that was the basis for the separation. Historical arguments were thrown in there to bolster the Lutheran position, that they were not a new church, that our teachings are actually the legitimate ones that go back to the apostles. Now, I think we're going to stop there, and really have established the idea, what is sort of a bold statement, the title of his work, The Reformation and the Invention of History. But really, it was this thorough study of the ancient documents, and not just scriptural documents, but the histories, that reemerged out of the Dark Ages and spurred real scholarship, really. And we're going to eventually relate scholarship and historical documents to the idea of we don't have to devote ourselves to a translation from 1630 AD. No matter how good it is, and it is a good translation to King James. So we're going to get there, so stay tuned. Come back and see you next week.
Cliffhanger.
philosophy. Thomas More Utopia. Economic policy or philosophy, I'm sure.
Utopia?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's. I mean, it's been obviously
Yeah.
19 years since I read it, but
you know, the title.
it's semi-satirical.
Oh.
He intended it to be.
Interesting.
And he did it, I mean, it's just literally his socio-economic, political satire on we're so far from a perfect civilization, how do we get there? And so he created this island, a figurative island, how could we build this from the ground up in a perfect society, where there's no greed, no want, no anything. And, I mean, it's, but if you will, it's very, you know, he was very smart and he knew it. So if you imagine someone that's, you know, even Luther, very smart and he knew it. And they wrote, and it's only, like you said, it's only 300 some pages, I think. But it's not a sit down afternoon read.
Yeah.
Because he has some, and it was written in Latin. And then translated.
Oh, yeah.
4 or 5 times, but English was 50 years later, they had it in English.
Anyone who
But it's crazy.
Mr. Thomas More is well worth the effort.
Oh, is that what it's from?
The Princess read Utopia. I found it boring and dull.
Yeah,
That's what he said.
it's.
Well, I'm glad that it's sort of satirical. I mean, it makes it a little more
Right.
digestible. Thank you, and I don't know if I've ever had a text out of the Psalm of Solomon, but I think it fit in this idea of marriage and joy and anticipation. But that's just my opinion.
I haven't seen Song of Solomon up there.
Say hi, Leroy, Martha.
Yeah.
Where is he at?
Is he at the nursing home where you work?
Yeah,
Okay.
Buffalo.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll tell him you were here.
Yeah.
How many times over the
Oh.
last few months? Where's Leah?
Oh.
Well, where's Leah?
Well, that's a great question.
Yeah.
If
Yeah.
She's working, I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, where's Leah?
Yeah. Let her tell him hi from us.
Yeah.
Please do.
Where's Bob?
Where's she?
Oh, so they live in Hutchinson, she works in Buffalo.
Yeah.
Like,
Well, we enjoyed Soap Dish.
did you actually enjoy that?
Yeah, that was good.
I think it's a pretty fun one personally.
It is.
It's a whole lot
See some baby actors.
oh.
Sue
Oh
and
my gosh, so
what's his
funny.
name?
Jr., Robert Downey
Yeah.
Jr. Oh